The morning the Alpha King learned her scent, Wren was on her knees in the third stall with a foaling strap in her teeth and both hands slicked to the wrist, and by the time she understood what had happened to her, it had already happened, the way frost happens to a window pane overnight, soundless, complete, and impossible to undo. There was a smell of cold iron in the air, because it had snowed in the night, and the stable doors had frozen half open, and the light coming through them lay across the straw in one long silver bar, the kind of light that has no warmth in it at all, only clarity. She would remember that light afterward, not his face, not the great hush that fell over the yard when he stopped walking, the light. The way it caught the steam off the mare's flank and turned it to something like smoke, and how, in the middle of all that ordinary morning, she had felt the herb mask on her wrists give way at last. 10 years of grey rue and hearth ash, worn thin by sweat and water and blood, and felt her own true self rise up off her skin into the cold, like a name being spoken aloud in a quiet room. She did not look up right away. That was the thing she would think about later, lying awake in a bed too soft to trust. She had not looked up. She had gone on with her hands, because the mare needed her, and because a woman who has spent 10 years being no one learns first of all to keep her eyes down and her work steady. It was the mare who lifted her head. It was the whole stable, every horse at once, going still and then not still, a ripple of ears and shifting hooves, 40 animals turning toward the doors, as if a wind had come through that only they could feel. And then a voice she had never heard before said one word into that silence, low and rough and disbelieving, as if the man saying it had forgotten how to shape it, you. The name her mother had given her was Neve. She had not answered to it in 10 years, and there were whole seasons when she forgot she had ever owned it, the way you forget the exact weight of a coat you stopped wearing. To everyone at Cairnhold, she was Wren, the stable hand, the quiet one, the small one, the girl who had turned up half-frozen at the gate 10 winters past and never quite left. She mucked stalls and mended tack and walked the yearlings on the frost-hard mornings when their breath came out of them in plumes, and she did it well enough and silently enough that after a while people stopped seeing her at all, which was precisely how she had wanted it. There is a kind of person a great house learns to look through. Wren had made herself into that person on purpose, stitch by stitch, the way you'd take in a garment 2 sizes too large, a shortening here, a hem there, until the shape of her fit no one's attention. She was not a beauty in any way the court would have named. Her hands were rough and split at the knuckle from cold and leather. She wore her hair scraped back under a wool cap gone grey with washing, and her boots, she owned one pair, had a split along the left seam that let the wet in every thaw, and she never fixed it, because fixing it would have meant asking for the leather, and asking for the leather would have meant being seen. She drank her tea bitter, a needle-sharp brew of pine and rootstock that the old kitchen woman brewed by the barrel and no one else could stomach, out of a chipped blue enamel mug she had claimed years ago from a scrap heap and guarded ever since, as though it were made of something finer. These were the whole of her possessions and the whole of her comforts, and she had taught herself to want nothing past them. She was not, whatever the court would later decide about her, a woman who panicked. She had learned young that panic is a luxury of people with somewhere to run. What she had instead was stillness, a deep, animal stillness that the horses trusted and that had kept her alive through a decade in which any wrong flicker of the eye, any careless word, might have undone her. She could stand in a burning stall and think, in order, one clear thought after another. She could take a colicking horse through the worst of a night without her hands ever shaking. She was good in a crisis and useless at a feast, and she had arranged her life so that it was made almost entirely of the first and never of the second. Why she had made herself so small, why a girl would spend the whole green length of her youth pretending to be no one, was a thing she told to no one, and had planned to carry unspoken into the ground. It was this. 10 years before, on a night that smelled of pitch and river fog, everyone she had ever loved had been killed in the space of an hour, and she had walked out of the ruin of it, with soot in her lungs, and her mother's last instruction ringing in her like a struck bell. Hide what you are. Hide it from everyone. Hide it most of all from the ones who will feel it, because that was the danger. That was the whole shape of the thing she had been fleeing. Neve of Coldwater had been born with a bond in her, a fated pull, the kind the old wolves spoke of in low voices, the kind that could be scented across a valley by the one it belonged to, and her mother had known, the way mothers know, that a bond like that made a girl a key, and that men who wanted doors opened would go to any length to hold the key. So she had taught her daughter the grey rue. She had shown her how to grind it with ash and a little tallow, and work it into the pulse points, wrist and throat, and the soft hollow behind the ear, so that what Neve was would sink beneath what Neve seemed. And Neve had done it every single day for 10 years, first thing, before the tea, before the mucking, before the light, until the doing of it was less a habit than a heartbeat. She had never known who the bond belonged to. That was the mercy and the horror of it both. She had never let herself find out. To find out would have been to walk toward the very thing that had gotten her family killed. She had not counted, in all her careful arithmetic, on running out of grey rue on a snowbound morning in the 10th year, with the road to the herbwife's cottage buried under a foot of drift, and a mare in the 3rd stall, trying to have her foal a fortnight early. Let it be understood how ordinary that morning began, because everything that came after only means anything against how ordinary it began. She had woken before the bell in the dark of the loft, cold to the bone, and lain a moment, listening to the particular silence of deep snow, which is not really silence, but a thickening of the world. She had felt for the little clay pot of grey rue in its niche by her pallet, and found it, when her fingers closed on it, lighter than it should have been. Light in the way a purse is light, which is to say frightening. She had scraped the last of it out with a fingernail. There had been enough to do her wrists and her throat, but not the place behind her ear, and she had thought, with the flat practicality that stood in her, instead of fear, I will get more from Maddox when the road opens. 2 days, 3, and she had gone down to the horses, because the horses do not wait on a woman's arithmetic. The mare was called Moth, a grey the colour of wood smoke, gentle-eyed, carrying her first foal, and carrying it badly. Wren had known for a day that it would come early and come hard, and she had made her bed of it, sleeping in snatches with one ear turned toward the stall, and when she came down that morning and saw Moth standing with her sides heaving and her tail clamped, and that particular wildness in her eye, she did not call for help. There was no help to call. Old Osk, the stable-master, was abed with the wet lung that the winter always brought him, and the 2 lads who might have run for the horse-leech were off through the drifts to break ice on the troughs, and the road to the town was closed. There was Wren, and there was the mare, and there was the cold silver bar of light beginning to reach through the frozen doors, and that was all the world contained. So she rolled up her sleeves and knelt and set to it, talking low the whole while, in the voice she kept for frightened animals, a voice pitched below thought, more breath than word. Easy, easy now, I'm here, easy. The foal was turned wrong, a foreleg back, a thing that kills mares and foals both, if it isn't fixed, and fixed fast. And she worked her hand in against the heat, and the terrible strength of the mare's straining, and found the folded leg, and eased it, slow, so slow, the way you'd coax a stubborn knot loose rather than tear it, all the time murmuring, easy, easy, I have you, easy now, until the leg came forward, and the shape of things changed under her fingers, and she knew it would live. She was so far down inside that work, so wholly given over to it, sweat sheeting off her, though the air bit like a blade, that she did not hear the yard fall quiet. She did not hear the horses at the far end lift their heads. She did not notice the grey rue failing on her skin, worn to nothing by heat and water and effort, or feel the 10-year mask slide off her like a coat dropped from the shoulders. She was aware only of the foal coming, wet and dark and impossibly long-legged, into the straw, and of the mare's great shuddering sigh, and of her own hands, and of the light. And then the light changed. A shadow crossed the silver bar, and a voice she had never heard said, You. And the whole careful decade of her life came apart in a single word. She knew who he was before she looked up, in the way you know a storm is a storm, without needing to name the cloud. Everyone at Cairnhold knew who he was. There was only one man whose coming could turn 40 horses to statues and silence a yard. They spoke of him the way you speak of weather that has killed people you knew. The stable lads told it best. Late, when the lamps were low, and the day's work was done, and there was nothing to do but tell things. They said the Alpha King, Ronan of the Iron Vale, had taken the throne of Cairnhold at 19, over the bodies of the men who murdered his father, and that he had done it in a single night, and that the snow that year had not gone white again until spring. They said he had a wolf in him that other wolves would not meet in the eyes. They said he had held the high passes against the raider clans for a decade, with a coldness that his own captains feared more than they feared the raiders, that he did not raise his voice because he had never needed to, that men obeyed the quiet of him the way you obey a drop in air pressure before a storm. Not because he threatened, because he was. They said other things too, the things that were more whisper than tale. They said the king had a grief in him, that once, years back, when he was young and newly crowned and riding the ruin of some border massacre far to the north, he had caught a scent on the wind, his own scent, the twin of it, the one the old wolves called the mate thread, and had followed it half-mad across 3 days of burned country, and lost it, and never found it again. They said he had searched for years. They said he had stopped searching. They said the stopping had made him colder than the searching ever had, that a man who has given up hope in a particular thing carries the giving up around like a stone sewn into his coat, and that if you wanted to know why the king of Cairnhold never took a mate, though half the high-born houses of the north had offered him their daughters, that was why. He was already spoken for, by a ghost, by a thread of scent on a dead wind 10 years gone, and he had made a marriage of the losing of it. That was the legend. Wren had heard it 100 times, and thought nothing of it beyond what you think of any tale told by lamplight, that it was probably half embroidery, and wholly not her concern. She had never once, in 10 years, connected the burned border country of the king's old grief with the burned border country of her own. Coldwater was a small place, and far away, and the north is full of ruins. She had not let herself do the arithmetic. The arithmetic would have been to walk toward the fire. She did the arithmetic now, kneeling in the bloodied straw with her hands still steaming in the cold, as the shadow of the king of Cairnhold fell across the silver bar of light, and his voice cracked on that single word, you, and she understood. All at once, the way a floor understands weight, exactly whose scent she had been drowning for 10 years, and exactly whose it had been calling to across the valley all along, and exactly why her mother, with her dying breath, had told her to hide it most of all from the ones who would feel it. She looked up. He was not what the tales had made him. The tales had made him enormous, a thing of shadow and appetite, and the man in the doorway was tall, but not vast, broad through the shoulder, but stripped down by winter to something spare and hard, with dark hair going early to grey at the temple, and a scar along the jaw, and eyes the pale grey of ice over deep water. He had come out to the stables in a plain riding coat, with the collar up against the cold, the way any man might, and there was snowmelt in his hair, and he was staring at her across 10 feet of straw and morning light, as though the ground had gone out from under him, and he had not yet begun to fall. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The foal shifted in the straw. Moth blew out a breath. Somewhere a horse stamped. "Get up," said one of the men behind him. A captain, mailed, with his hand near his sword out of pure reflex, because his king had stopped like a man walking into a wall, and that was not a thing captains liked to see. "Girl, on your feet before the—" "No," the king said. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way you'd set a cup down on a table. And the captain went quiet, and the whole yard went quiet, and Ronan of the Iron Vale took one step into the stable, out of the silver light, and into the dimness where she knelt, and crouched down slowly, the way a man lowers himself near a wounded animal, until his pale eyes were level with hers. "Say it again," he said. His voice had gone very low and very careful. "The thing you were saying. To the horse. Say it again." She did not understand at first. Then she did. He had heard her. Through the yard and the cold he had caught the low breath voice she used on frightened things, the words worn smooth by 10 years of use, and something in him had turned over at the sound of them, the way something in the horses had turned over. And he needed, she saw it plainly, saw the need in his face stripped naked of every cold thing the tales had put there. He needed to hear it again to be sure he had not dreamed it. She should have run. She thought about running. There was the door to the tack room, and past it, the small door to the yard, and past that, the drifts and the closed road, and no hope at all, and she did the arithmetic of it, in half a breath, and knew it came to nothing. There was nowhere. There had, she understood with a strange cold calm, never been anywhere. She had only been telling herself there was, for 10 years, says, the way a child tells itself the dark is empty. So she did not run. She looked at the king of Cairnhold crouched in the straw of her stable, with snowmelt in his hair and grief coming up in his face, like water coming up through ice. And she said, in the low breath voice, because it was the only voice she had left that was truly hers, "Easy, easy now." And she watched the last of the man's composure go. He did not touch her. She noted that, even then, that he did not reach for her, did not seize her, did not do any of the things the tales of ravenous kings would have promised. He was not, she would learn, a man who touched casually. He only knelt there in the straw and closed his eyes for the length of 3 breaths, and when he opened them, there was something in them she had no armor against, because she had spent 10 years building armor against fear and threat and desire, and had never once thought to build any against this, against being found, against being known, against a man looking at her, as though she were not the last thing he had lost, but the first thing he had ever, in all his cold and armored life, wanted to keep. 10 years, he said. Not to her exactly, to the air, to the ledger of his own long grief. "You were, all this time you were, down the hill," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "In your stable." Yes. A sound came out of him that was almost a laugh, and was not one. He passed a hand over his mouth. Behind him, the captain and the guards stood like men who had walked into a scene from a story and did not know their lines. "What is your name?" the king said. And here was the hinge of it, the small door that all the rest of her life would turn on, and she felt the weight of it, and chose, kneeling there, deliberately, the way she chose everything. She could give him Wren. Wren was safe. Wren was no one. Wren could perhaps still be walked back into the crowd of servants and forgotten. Or she could give him the other name, the true one, the one her mother had sewn into her like a hidden seam, and by giving it, end the 10 years and begin whatever this was going to be. She thought about her mother's voice in the pitch black. She thought about the grey rue running out. She thought that some doors, once a storm has found them, do not close again, no matter how hard you lean. "Neve," she said. "My name is Neve, of Coldwater." She watched the name land in him. She watched him recognize the place. Coldwater, the burned border country, the massacre he had ridden through at 19, with the mate thread breaking in his hands. She watched a decade of his grief, and a decade of her hiding, meet in the cold air of a stable, and understand, all at once, that they had been 2 halves of the same wound the whole time, walking the same castle, breathing the same winters, and never once knowing. "Neve," he said, as if he were learning a word in a language he had thought dead. Neve, and outside, indifferent to all of it, the snow began again, small and dry and endless, sifting down through the silver light, onto the frozen yard, onto the closed road, onto the whole white world that had, without asking her, just changed. They did not let her walk back to the loft. She had thought, in the numb hour after, for there was an hour after, a strange administrative hour, in which the foal had to be seen to, and moth settled, and the blood sluiced off the flags, and she did all of it herself, because no one dared take the work from her, and she would not have let them. She had thought that perhaps it would go no further than a stable, that the king would master himself, and the moment would pass into the cold, and she could go back to being no one. She was wrong. She understood how wrong when she came out into the yard at last, drying her hands on a rag, and found that the yard had filled. Guards, stewards, a woman in grey with keys at her belt. And the king, who had not left, who had stood the whole hour by the stable wall, with his arms folded, and the snow gathering on his shoulders like a man keeping a vigil, watching the doors as though she might dissolve if he looked away. "Her things," he said to the woman with the keys when Wren came out. "Bring down whatever is hers." "There's nothing," Wren said. "A pallet, a mug." "Bring the mug," said the king. And that was how she came to walk up the hill to the keep of Cairnhold in the falling snow, in her split-seamed boots and her grey wool cap, with a king on one side of her holding his silence like a held breath, and a chipped blue enamel mug carried behind her by a steward on a cushion, as though it were a crown, and the whole white weight of a life she had spent 10 years refusing settling down over her, cold and quiet and final, like snow. She had lived 10 years at the foot of Cairnhold, and had never once been inside it. That was not so strange as it sounds. A great keep is a country unto itself, and the people who keep its horses live in one province of it, and never cross into the others. The stables had their own world, low and warm and smelling of hay and dung and leather and horse, and it had been world enough. She had seen the keep only as a shape against the sky, a black spine of towers on the ridge, a thing of the weather more than of people, taking the storms on its shoulders so the valley below could keep its houses. She had watched its windows light at dusk, and never wondered whose hands lit them. Now she walked in under the gate for the first time, and the cold changed. That was the first thing, the temperature. Outside, the cold had teeth. It came off the snow, and got into the seam of her boot, and the marrow of her. Inside the gate, in the great hall, the cold went soft and dim and stony, the particular cold of thick walls, a cold that did not bite, but pressed, even and ancient, the accumulated chill of centuries of winter, held in stone, that the fires never wholly warmed. The air smelled of wood smoke and cold iron, and beeswax and, underneath, faintly, of the men and dogs and centuries the place was made of. There were tapestries on the walls gone dark with age, and she could not have said what they showed, only that they moved a little in the draughts, as though the figures in them breathed. The floor was flagstone, worn to a shine in a path down the centre, where 10,000 boots had passed, and rough at the edges where none did, and she found her own eyes going to that worn path, and her own feet going to it, because a servant walks where servants have worn the stone, and even here, even now, the 10 years walked her. They took her up. Stairs and stairs, a spiral tower stair worn to a slick sway in the middle of each step, a small arched window, at every turn, showing the same falling snow from a little higher up each time, so that she climbed, and the valley fell away beneath her, and the stable, her whole world, dwindled to a low dark roof with a thread of smoke, and then to nothing, hidden by the shoulder of the tower. She climbed out of her old life one stone step at a time, and the light through the arrow slits was the same silver as the light in the stable had been, cold and clarifying, and she thought, the light at least is the same. She held to that. The light was the same. They gave her a room she could not at first make sense of. It had a window of real glass, small panes of it, greenish and rippled, set in lead, so that the snow beyond swam a little, and a fire already lit and cracking in a stone hearth, and a bed with a carved post at each corner, and a coverlet of grey wool as thick as a saddle blanket, and a chair, and a table, and a ewer of water that steamed. It was not a grand room. She would understand later that by the measure of the keep, it was a plain room, a good guest's room, nothing more. But she had slept 10 years on a pallet in a loft, with the frost on the inside of the boards, and she stood in the doorway of that plain, warm room, and could not go in, because it was too much, because the warmth of it was almost an insult to the cold she had made her home. and because she did not trust anything that was given to her so easily. The steward set the blue enamel mug down on the table, with great ceremony, and withdrew. The woman with the keys, the housekeeper Wren would learn, a spare grey woman named Dame Iseult, showed her the ewer and the fire, and the bell-pull, and said, in the flat voice of a woman who had seen many strange things come up the tower stair, and did not intend to be surprised by one more, that a bath would be sent, and clothes, and that the king would send for her when she was rested. I don't need clothes, Wren said. I have clothes. Dame Iseult looked at the split-seamed boots, and the grey cap, and the stable-stained wool, and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and left. And Wren stood alone in the warm, strange room, with the snow swimming in the green glass, and did not sit on the bed, and did not touch the water, and after a while crossed the room and picked up the chipped blue mug from the fine table, where it sat like a plain word in the middle of an elaborate sentence, and held it in both hands, and felt, for the first time since the light had changed in the stable, something close to steady. She was not a woman who wept easily. She did not weep now. She only stood at the green window with her one true possession in her hands, and watched the snow come down over the valley, where her whole small life lay buried, and did the one thing she had always been able to do, no matter what the world took from her. She thought, in order, one clear thought after another. She thought, he will want things. She thought, everyone who has ever found out what I am has wanted things. She thought, I will not be a key. And then, more quietly, in a voice underneath the others, the voice she did not often let speak. He did not touch me. He knelt in the straw, and he did not touch me, and he brought the mug. She set the mug down. She did not let that last thought finish. Some doors you do not open, even to yourself, when a storm is on the other side. He sent for her at dusk, and she went as she was, in her own clothes, her hair scraped back, her boots split, because she had decided, standing at the window, that whatever else this was going to be, she would walk into it as herself, and not as the thing they wanted to dress her into. If he wanted Neve of Coldwater, he would have her in stable wool and a mended cap, or not at all. They brought her to a smaller room off the great hall, a private room, warm, low-ceilinged, with a fire and 2 chairs, and a long table with the remnants of maps still on it, weighted at the corners with river stones. He was standing at the window when she came in, and he had changed out of the riding coat into something plainer and darker, and he turned when the door opened and looked at her, and she watched him take in the stable wool and the split boots and the mended cap, and she watched him understand what she was telling him by wearing them, and she watched him, she had not expected this, approve. Something eased in his hard face. He gestured to the chair across the table from him, not beside him, the far chair, the safe distance, and she understood that too, and sat. There was tea on the table. Not her bitter needle brew, a finer thing, pale gold, in a real cup, but there beside it, incongruous, was the blue enamel mug, filled with something dark, and she understood he had asked what she drank, and been told, and had it brewed. She did not comment on it, but she saw it, and he saw her see it, and neither of them said anything, and that was the first conversation they had, and it was conducted entirely in objects. You'll want to know what happens now, he said. I'll want to know what you want, she said. That's usually the same question, but sometimes it isn't. The corner of his mouth moved, blunt. I've had 10 years of saying nothing, she said. I find I've a store of it saved up. He came and sat, at last, in the near chair, not beside her, but nearer than the window, at his end of the table. He wrapped his hands around the fine cup and did not drink from it, and she noticed that his hands, like hers, were split at the knuckle, a fighter's hands, a horseman's hands, not a soft man's, and she filed the noticing away without letting it mean anything. You know what you are to me, he said. You've known since the stable. You did the arithmetic. I watched you do it. I know what the tales say I am. The tales are true, for once. He turned the cup a quarter turn on the table. I caught your scent at Coldwater, 10 years ago, in the ash, when I was 19, and had just buried my father, and come north to see what the raiders had done to the border. I thought I'd lost my mind. I followed it 3 days. It went to a river, and the river took it, and I never found it again. And I have spent 10 years believing you dead, believing I'd been shown the one thing that could complete me, and then had it drowned in front of me as a lesson, a cruelty. I made a hard man of myself around the shape of it. He looked up. And you were down the hill, mucking my stalls, rubbing witch's rue on your wrists every morning to keep me from finding you. Yes, she said. Why? And there it was, the question the whole day had been walking toward, and she found she could answer it plainly, now that there was no more use in hiding. Because my mother told me, a bond makes a woman a key, she said, and I have watched what men do to get hold of a key. The raiders didn't come to Coldwater for grain. They came because word had gone out that there was a fated daughter in the Coldwater line, a girl who could be scented across a valley, who could be married into power, who could open a door in the old bloodlines that had been shut for 100 years. They came for me. They killed everyone I had to try to take me, and they'd have taken me too, except my mother put me out a back window into the fog and taught me the rue with her hands shaking, and told me, hide it from everyone. Hide it most of all from the ones who will feel it. Because the ones who will feel it are the ones who'll come. She held his pale eyes across the table. You're the one who would feel it. So you were the one I hid from hardest, not because of you. I didn't know it was you, but because of what you are. A door. And I was the key. And I did not want to be used to open anything, ever again, by anyone. He was quiet a long moment. The fire ticked. Snow whispered at the green glass. I did not come for Coldwater, he said at last, low. I came after. I came to bury it. I want you to know that, before we go any further, whatever else you decide I am. I did not send those men. I have spent 10 years hunting the clan that did, and I have unmade 3 of their 4 holds, and the 4th I will unmake before I die. I did not come to take the key. I came too late to save the door. He stopped. Something worked in his jaw. You've spent 10 years hiding from the one man in the north who would have burned the world down to keep you from being taken. That's the joke of it. That's the shape of the grief I made myself around. That I came too late. And you were teaching yourself, every single morning, to make sure I stayed too late forever. She had not expected that to hurt. She had built no armor against it. And it got in. And she looked down at the maps on the table so he would not see it get in. So, she said, when she could. What happens now? You still haven't said what you want. I want you to stay, he said simply. That's all. That's the whole of it. I know how it looks. A king finds his fated mate mucking his stables and drags her up the tower and says stay, and it looks like the raiders all over again with a crown on. I know. So I'll say the rest of it plainly, so there's no mistaking me. He set the cup down and folded his scarred hands on the table and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the straw, stripped of everything cold. The bond doesn't compel you. Whatever you've heard, it doesn't. It's a pull, not a rope. I can feel you like a fire in the next room, and it will not, it cannot, make you love me, or want me, or so much as sit at my table if you don't choose to. If you want to walk down the hill in the spring and never come back, I will give you a horse and coin and safe passage to any border you name, and I will never once come looking, though it costs me the last warm thing in me to say so. I mean that. Ask anyone what I am, and then believe me when I say I mean it. She studied him. She was very good at studying. 10 years of watching from the edges of rooms had made her able to read a man the way she read a horse, by the set of the ears and the weight on the feet, and the thing behind the eyes. And what she read in Ronan of the Iron Vale was not the ravenous king of the tales, and not, either, a soft man playing at kindness. It was a hard man telling the truth at cost to himself, which is the rarest thing a hard man ever does, and she found, warily, against her will, filing it away without letting it mean anything, that she believed him. Then here are my conditions, she said, since you're offering. I didn't offer conditions. You offered a horse, and safe passage in the spring. That tells me you're a man who bargains fair, so I'm bargaining. She sat forward. 1. I keep the horses. I don't care what the court thinks a mate of yours should do with her hands. My hands do this. If I stop, I'll go mad in a fortnight and be no use to you or to me, so I keep the stables, and Moth, and the foal, and I go down that hill every morning and I work. That's not a request. That's the price of my staying sane. Done, he said, without a breath's pause, and she saw that it pleased him, and was annoyed that it pleased her, that it pleased him. 2. The door of whatever room I sleep in locks from the inside, and I hold the only key. Not because I think you'd, but because I have spent 10 years being the only thing standing between myself and the world, and I am not ready to hand that watch to anyone, king or not. I'll come to your table. I'll learn your keep. But I sleep behind my own lock until I say otherwise, and if I never say otherwise, that's my right, and the bond be damned. Something moved in his face. Not offense. Respect, she thought. He inclined his head. Done. The smith will cut you a key tonight, and there'll be no copy. 3. And here she paused, because the third was the true one, the one the other two had been clearing ground for. You don't tell them what I am. Not yet. Not the court, not the captains, not the whole shrieking machine of high-born houses who've been offering you their daughters for 10 years and will lose their minds when they find you've picked a stable hand. Give me the winter. Let me learn this place before it learns me. Let me be, for a season more, no one, while I decide whether I can bear to be someone. That's the last condition, and it's the one I'll walk down the hill over if you refuse it. He was quiet, weighing it, and she watched him weigh it, and knew what it cost him. Because a man who has grieved a thing for 10 years and just gotten it back wants, more than anything, to stand on the wall and roar the getting back to the whole valley. And he set that want down, deliberately, the way he'd sat in the far chair and not the near one. And he said, the winter. Done. 3 conditions, 3 yeses. You bargain like someone who's had 10 years to practice saying nothing and has decided all at once to spend the savings. I told you, she said. I've a store of it saved up. And that, not a touch, not a vow, not anything the tales would have recognized, was the beginning of it. 2 hard people, at either end of a long table, in a warm room, over cooling tea and a chipped blue mug, agreeing on the terms of a winter. She would think, much later, that everything true that ever grew between them had been planted in that hour, in the plainness of it, in the fact that the first thing he ever gave her was not a jewel or a vow, but a lock and her own key. So began the slow white season that she would remember, for the rest of a long life, as the winter she was found. She had braced for it to be a captivity, however gilded. It was not. She kept waiting for the walls to close, waiting for the king to forget his 3 yeses, waiting for the pull he'd spoken of to become the rope her mother had warned her of, waiting for the moment when someone would decide that a found key ought to be used. The moment did not come. Instead there came, in its place, something she had no name for and no defenses against, because it arrived so slowly and so plainly that she was halfway drowned in it before she noticed the water had risen at all. It came as a shape to her days. On the first morning she woke in the tower before the bell, cold out of habit though the room was warm, and lay a moment, reaching for a pot of grey roux that was not there and would never be there again, and felt the strangeness of that, of waking and not hiding, of letting her own scent rise off her skin, into a room for the first time in 10 years, and then she got up and dressed in her own wool, and went down the tower, and out into the blue dark, and across the yard to the stable, because the horses did not care that the world had changed, and Moth's foal needed watching, and the troughs would be iced. And that was the shape of it. That was the anchor. Whatever else the day held, it began in the stable, in the warm dung and leather dark, with her own 2 hands, and it was hers. But the days had ends, now, that they had never had before, and the ends of them were where the trouble grew. Because in the evenings, the king ate at a small table in the private room off the great hall. Not the high table of the great hall, which she'd feared, with its long benches and its watching court, but a plain table for two, in a warm, low room. And on the second evening, a steward came to the stable at dusk, with a message that had clearly been made as small and unfrightening as a message from a king could be made, which was simply, "He wonders if you'll eat." Not a summons, a wondering. And she stood in the stable with straw in her hair, and thought about the far chair, and the near chair, and the lock on her door, and the chipped mug on the fine table, and thought, "He is trying not to frighten me, and he is doing it clumsily, and the clumsiness is the truest thing about it," and she went. They ate in near silence that first evening. She was not a woman who filled silence. She had spent 10 years being made of it. And he, it turned out, was not a man who filled it either. He had been so long the terror of his own hall that men fell quiet around him, and he had stopped expecting talk, and so the two of them sat over bread and a dish of barley and mutton and the fire, and said almost nothing, and it was not uncomfortable. That was the thing that undid her, slowly, over the weeks. It was not uncomfortable. She had braced for the labor of a courtship, the awful performance of it, and instead she got a man who was as content to be quiet as she was, and two hard people being quiet together over food turns out to be a kind of intimacy that no amount of talk could counterfeit. On the fourth evening he asked her about the foal, and she found she could talk about the foal, a colt, leggy and dark, already willful, for the better part of an hour, and he listened the way he did everything, without moving much, his pale eyes on her, and asked exactly the right small questions. The questions of a man who had grown up around horses and loved them. And she went back up the tower that night and lay behind her lock and realized she had talked more in that 1 hour than she had in whole years, and that she had not once, the whole time, felt like a key. On the 9th evening it snowed so hard that the fires guttered in the drafts, and she came up from the stable frozen to the marrow, her split boot soaked through, her hands too stiff to feel, and he took one look at her in the doorway and did not say a word about it, only got up and dragged the second chair around to the fire, close to it, and moved his own plate down to the low table by the hearth, and they ate on the floor by the fire like two children, and he poured hot water over the dark, bitter leaves into the blue enamel mug and put it into her stiff red hands himself. The first time he'd touched her, and it was only his fingers against the backs of her fingers for half a breath as the mug passed between them, and neither of them acknowledged it, but she felt it go through her like heat, going into a frozen thing, painful and necessary, and she looked at the fire and not at him. "Your boot's done for," he said, into the fire, not at her. "It's got another winter in it." "It's got no winters in it. There's water coming out of the seam onto my floor. I'll mend it. You've said that about the bridle strap in the tack room for a month. Osk told me. He says you've mended it 4 times and it wants replacing, and you keep mending it." She looked at him then. "You've been asking Osk about me." "I've been asking everyone about you," he said, without a scrap of shame. "For 10 years I had nothing to ask about. Now there's a whole person down the hill, and everyone but me has known her for a decade. Of course I'm asking. I know you drink tea that would strip paint, and you've never once let the lads carry a hay bale you could carry yourself, and you sing to the colicky ones, low, so no one hears, except everyone hears. I know you've a mug you'd fight a man for. I know you mend things past mending because you don't like to ask for what's new. I know you sleep behind a lock." He turned the last of his own tea in the fine cup. "I'm learning you the only way you'll let me. From the outside in, slowly, the way you'd gentle a horse that's been badly handled." And she thought, he knows exactly what he's doing. And she thought, he's telling me he knows exactly what he's doing, which is the opposite of what a man does who means to trap you. And she did not answer, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't say too much, and she drank her paint-stripping tea out of her chipped mug on the floor of an Alpha King's private room while the snow came down, and let the silence hold what she couldn't. She found her confidant in the kitchens, which was where a woman like her would always end up finding one. Halla ran the great kitchens of Cairnhold, the way the king ran the north, by a coldness that everyone feared and a fairness that everyone, in the end, trusted. She was somewhere past 60 and built like a cellar door, with forearms a smith would have envied and an eye that missed nothing. And she had been at Cairnhold since before the king was born, and had opinions about all of it, and gave them freely and to anyone. She was the one who brewed the barrel of bitter needle tea that only Wren drank, and had brewed it for years wondering who in the seven hells kept ordering it. And when she found out it was the small grey stable hand who'd turned up at the king's own table, she summoned Wren to the kitchens on a pretext about the tea, and looked her up and down over a bench of rising dough, and said, without preamble, "So you're the ghost he's been marrying for 10 years. Wren went still. "Oh, don't," Halla said, and slapped flour off her hands. Aesult keeps her mouth shut, and the captains keep theirs, and the court still thinks you're a novelty he'll tire of by spring. But I've buttered that man's bread since he had no teeth, girl, and I knew what I was looking at the first night you came up that stair. He's had a hole in him, the exact shape of a person for 10 years. And here's a person, walked out of his own stables, that exact shape. I'm old. I'm not blind." She jerked her chin at the bench. "Sit. Have you eaten? You've the look of a woman who's decided eating is a weakness." Wren sat, because you did not sit when Halla told you to sit. And Halla put a heel of new bread and a dish of dripping in front of her, and stood over her with her flower-white arms folded until she ate it. And while she ate, Halla talked, and Wren understood that she had been brought here to be talked at, which was Halla's way of doing a kindness, of saying the things a person needed said and could not say to herself. "You're waiting for the trap," Halla said. It was not a question. "Course you are. Look at you. You've got the eyes of a thing that's been hunted. I've cooked for hunted things before. Soldiers come back from the passes. Women come up from the villages after the raiders pass through. They all sit like you sit, with their backs to the wall and one foot pointed at the door. So you're waiting for him to turn, for the lock to stop being your lock, for the kindness to be a debt he calls in." She leaned on the bench. "And I'll tell you a thing, girl, because no one else in this frozen pile will, because they're all too busy being afraid of him. He won't turn. I've known that man 40 years, boy and king, and the one thing he's never done, not once, not to me, not to the lowest scullion, is turn. He's cold, God knows. He's hard as the wall. He'll unmake a raider clan, and sleep sound the same night. But he does not lie, and he does not break his word, and he does not use people. And the reason the court's afraid of him isn't that he's cruel, it's that he isn't, and they don't know what to do with a powerful man who won't be bought or flattered or led by the nose. You could stand behind that lock of yours till you're my age, and he'd cut you a new key every year and never once ask what you did with the old one." She straightened. "The trap you're waiting for isn't coming. So the only question left, girl, is how long you're going to keep yourself hungry and cold and behind a lock, guarding against a thing that isn't going to happen, while a good winter goes by outside the door." Wren looked at the empty dish. She did not answer for a while. 10 years is a long time to learn a thing," she said at last. "Longer to unlearn it." "Aye." Halla took the dish. "But you've all winter, and I'll tell you the truth, since I'm telling truths. It's not him I'm worried for. He's waited 10 years, he can wait 10 more. He's got the patience of the mountain. It's you. It's a hard thing to watch. A person guarding a door so long they forget there was ever anything behind it worth guarding. You didn't just hide what you are from him, girl. You hid it from yourself. 10 years of rue on your wrists every morning. You rubbed the whole of you out, a little every day, to keep from being found. And now you're found, and the rue's gone, and you don't know how to be the thing you spent 10 years erasing." She looked at Wren, not unkindly. "That's the real lock. And I can't cut you a key for that one. Nor can he. That's yours to pick." And Wren went back up the hill through the snow, with the bread warm in her, and Halla's words colder and truer in her than any wind. And behind her lock that night, she held up her own wrists in the firelight, and looked at them, bare, unmasked, her own scent rising off her own skin into her own room, and thought about how strange it was to be the only person in the world afraid of being herself. The winter deepened, and the rituals deepened with it, and neither of them ever named them rituals, which was how she knew they were. It was the 11th night that he mended her boot. She had not asked him to. She would never have asked him to. She had come up from the stable and left the wet boots by the fire to dry, as she always did, and gone to wash. And when she came back, there he was, in the near chair with her split left boot, in his big scarred hands, and an awl, and a length of waxed thread, working the seam closed with the neat, unhurried competence of a man who had spent hard years in the field, where you mend your own gear, or go without. And she stood in the doorway and watched the King of the North sew up a stable-hand's boot by firelight, and did not know what to do with the thing that happened in her chest. "You had no right," she said, "but it came out without any edge on it at all. You'd not have let me buy you a new one," he said, not looking up, pulling the thread taut. "So I'm not buying you one. I'm mending this one. There's a difference, and you're the one who taught it to me. Mending's not the same as giving. You've been mending that bridle strap for a month rather than take a new one." I paid attention. He bit the thread off, turned the boot, examined his work, and set it by the fire beside its mate. "There, it'll keep the wet out now. You can go on wearing the ugly thing till it falls off your foot in the spring, and I'll not say another word about it." And she came and sat in the far chair. She still sat in the far chair most nights, though the distance had begun to feel less like a wall and more like a habit she hadn't gotten round to breaking. And she looked at her mended boot by the fire, and she said, quietly, "Thank you." And it was the first thank you she had given him for anything, and they both knew it, and neither of them made anything of it, and that was the mercy of him. He never made anything of the ground she gave. He only noted it, and held it, and waited for the next. On the 14th evening, she stayed late, and they played at draughts, with a set carved from bone and dark wood, and he was better than her, and did not let her win, which she respected, and she got better fast, which he respected. And somewhere past midnight, she realized she had been laughing, actually laughing, low in her chest, at some dry thing he'd said about a captain, and had not noticed herself doing it, and the noticing stopped the laugh cold, and he saw it stop, and he said, gently, not pushing, "You're allowed, you know." "Allowed what?" "That. Whatever that was, that you just took back." He moved a piece. "You do it every time. You'll ease. For a minute, I'll watch the whole 10 years go off your shoulders like a coat, and then you'll catch yourself easing, and haul it all back on, quick, before it can be seen. You did it just now. You laughed, and then you took the laugh back, and put your walls up so fast, I felt the wind of it." He looked up at her across the little board of bone and wood. "You don't have to. That's all I'll say. Not tonight. Not ever. Whenever you like. You don't have to take it back." She looked at the board. She thought about it. She thought about Halla saying you hid it from yourself. She thought about 10 years of rue. And she did a thing then that frightened her more than the raiders had, more than the tower had, more than the king himself had. She let the laugh come back. She let herself, deliberately, sitting in the far chair, with her mended boot drying by the fire, and her chipped mug of paint-stripping tea cooling at her elbow, ease. She let the coat come off, and she watched him watch it happen, and watched him not move, not reach, not make anything of it, only sit very still, on the other side of the little board, the way you sit very still when a wild thing has come, against all its instincts, to eat from your open hand. Neither of them said anything. He moved a piece. She moved a piece, the fire settled, and the 10 years, for the length of that one game, stayed off her shoulders where she'd set them down, and the room was warm, and she did not haul them back on, and that, not the boot, not the mug, not the lock. That was the night she thought of afterward, as the night she began, in earnest, to stay. 3 weeks after she had come up the hill, the deep cold broke for a spell, and the road opened, and the world remembered that Cairnhold had a court. She had almost forgotten it herself. The private room and the stable and the kitchens had become the whole of her keep, a small, warm country of 3 places and 3 people, the king and Osk and Halla, and she had let herself believe, in the way of people who have found a good thing and are afraid of it, that it might go on being only that. It could not, of course. A king has a court the way a mountain has weather, and when the road opened, the weather came in. It came in the person of Lady Sunniva Voss. The Voss were one of the great houses of the north, and Lady Sunniva was the flower of them. Golden, tall, exquisitely dressed, a she-wolf of high blood and higher expectation, and she had been offered to the King of Cairnhold 3 times over the years, by a father who could not understand why a match so obvious should keep failing to make itself. She arrived with the opening of the road, ostensibly to bring the winter tithe of her father's holdings, actually to remind the king, in the flesh, of the thing he was refusing, and she came into the great hall in a gown the colour of old wine, with fur at the collar and jewels at her throat, and she was, Wren saw from the shadows where she stood, genuinely beautiful, in the polished, certain way of a woman who has never once in her life had to make herself small. There was to be a feast. A king does not turn away a great house at his gate in winter, and so the great hall was opened, and the long tables laid, and the court, which had been scattered and drowsing through the cold, assembled itself in furs and finery, and Wren, who had spent 3 weeks eating at a plain table for 2, in a warm private room, found herself, for the first time, required to enter the hall. She almost did not go. She stood at the top of the tower stair in her stable wool, with her scraped-back hair and her mended boots, and thought, this is the trap after all. Not his, but theirs. This is the room that will use me, that will look at me and price me and put me in my place. And she nearly turned back. But the king had sent no summons, only again a wondering, carried by a nervous page. He says you needn't come. He says if you come he'll be glad, and if you don't he'll understand, and either way there's a seat kept. And it was the either way that decided her. A man who leaves the door open on both sides is not laying a trap. So she went down, in her own wool, deliberately, as herself, and walked into the great blazing hall of Cairnhold with its 100 candles and its furred and jewelled court, and every head turned, and the whispering started, and she walked through it to the seat that had been kept, not at the high table, at her own quiet request, but near it, at the head of the second, close enough to be honoured, and far enough to breathe, and she sat, and she was, in that whole shining room, the only person not wearing something worth more than a horse. Lady Sunniva found her within the hour. She came down from the high table on some pretext of admiring the hall, drifting on a current of wine and certainty, and she stopped by Wren's place and looked at her, really looked, the long, appraising, dismantling look of a woman, assessing a rival, and finding, to her visible relief, nothing to fear, and she smiled, and it was a lovely smile, and there was nothing lovely under it. "You're the king's little curiosity," Sunniva said, warm as poisoned honey. "The stable girl. Everyone's been telling me. How charming, how very rustic of him. He always did have a soldier's tastes. Plain fare, plain company, no ceremony. I suppose after a decade of us offering him silk, he wanted to see how homespun felt." She let her gaze travel down Wren's wool and up again. "Tell me, what is it exactly that you do for him? In the evenings, when he tires of the court, one hears he keeps you close." It was beautifully done. It was an accusation, and an insult, and a trap, all folded into a question a lady could deny ever having made, and it was designed to make Wren flush, or stammer, or reach for a dignity she did not have the blood to claim. And around them, the nearer tables had gone quiet to listen, because a court loves nothing so much as watching a nobody be put in her place. But Wren was not a woman who panicked, and she had spent 10 years being looked through and priced and dismissed by people who thought a stable hand had no interior, and she had learned in that decade a thing the Lady Sunniva, for all her blood, had never had cause to learn, that the person everyone underestimates holds a strange, cold power, because she has nothing to protect and nothing to prove, and can therefore say the true thing without fear, while the great must always guard their greatness. So Wren looked up at the Golden Lady, unhurried, and did not flush, and said, in her plain, low voice, pitched just loud enough for the listening tables, "In the evenings I eat with him, mostly. He's quiet company, which suits me, as I'm quiet company myself. And I mend his boots, when they want it, and he mends mine. And we play at draughts, and he beats me, though less than he used to." She let a small silence sit. "As for what I do for him, I couldn't say, my lady. You'd have to ask him. But I'll tell you what he does for me, since you've asked so kindly. He cut me a key to my own door, and swore there'd be no copy, and there's been none. That's the whole of it. A man who gives a woman the only key to her own lock and keeps his word about it." She picked up her chipped blue mug of paint-stripping tea and took a slow sip, watching the lady over the rim. "I find I've very little use for silk, after that." The silence held, and then, from the high table, where the king had been sitting with his captains, apparently deep in some matter of the passes, apparently not listening at all, came his voice, dry and low and carrying, without his even turning his head. "She beat me twice last week, Lady Sunniva. She's being modest. And I'll ask you not to stand over my guest quite so long. It's poor manners in my hall, and you were raised too well for it." It was not loud. It was never loud with him, but it fell into the hall like a stone into a pond, and the rings of it went out to every table, and Lady Sunniva Voss, Flower of the North, offered thrice, certain of her blood, stood for one frozen instant, with the whole court watching her be corrected by a king on behalf of a stable hand, and then she gathered her wine-dark skirts and her ruined composure, and swept back to the high table with a smile nailed to her face, and the moment was over, and the whispering that started again was a different whispering than before. Wren sat with her heart going hard behind her ribs and her chipped mug in her hands, and did not look at the king, and the king did not look at her, and across the length of the blazing hall the two of them held, in the deliberate not looking, a thing that neither the court nor the Golden Lady would ever be permitted to see. She did not sleep well after the feast. It was not the lady's cruelty that kept her awake. She had weathered crueler, from harder people, over longer years. It was the other thing. It was the way the king had spoken across the hall on her behalf, and the way the whole court had turned, and the way she had felt, for one dangerous instant under all those watching eyes, not exposed but defended, which was a sensation so foreign to her that her body did not know how to hold it, and had spent the rest of the night trying to give it back. She lay behind her lock and looked at the ceiling and thought about it. She thought about the far chair and the near chair. She thought about how the distance between them had been getting shorter for 3 weeks without either of them ever moving their chairs, and how a person can be crossed toward without a single step being taken. She thought that she was in more danger, now, from the wanting to stay, than she had ever been from the fearing to. And she thought about Lady Sunniva's face, in the frozen instant before she'd swept away, not the humiliation, but the thing underneath the humiliation, the quick, calculating narrowing of the eyes that Wren had seen on the faces of horse traders, and worse, the look of a person who has been beaten in the small game and is already moving pieces in a larger one. She will not simply go home, Wren thought. Women like that do not simply go home. And she was right, though it would be some days before she learned how right, and by then, the cold would have nearly killed her first. It was the 17th night that the storm came down off the passes, and it was the worst storm in 40 years, and Halla, who had seen 40 years of them, said so. It came fast, the way the killing storms do, the sky going the colour of a bruise by mid-afternoon, the wind swinging round to the north and finding its teeth, the first snow driving sideways so hard it stung the skin like sand. By dark the world had been erased. There was no valley, no yard, no hill. There was only the roar and the white and the cold. That was not the pressing cold of the keep stone, but the other cold, the hunting cold, the cold that comes down off the passes with a will in it, and looks for warm things to put out. The keep drew in on itself. Fires were built up. The court huddled. And Wren, who had gone down to the stable at dusk, as she always did, to see the horses settled, got caught on the wrong side of it when it broke, and made a choice that nearly ended her. Because the colt was gone. Moth's colt. The dark, leggy, willful one, 4 weeks old, and full of a foal's terrible confidence, had gotten out. A latch worked loose, a gap in the paddock rail, the particular genius that young things have for finding the one way out. However it happened, when Wren did her count in the shrieking dark, the colt was not there, and Moth was screaming at the paddock rail with her ears flat, and her whole body pointed at the white roaring nothing beyond it, and Wren did the arithmetic in half a breath, and knew it came to something terrible. A 4-week foal, in this, it had minutes, not many. She should have gone for the lads. She thought about going for the lads. But the lads were up at the keep, and the yard was already a whiteout, and the colt had minutes, not the time it would take to climb the hill and rouse help and come back. And there was no one between that foal and the killing cold but her, the way there had never, in 10 years, been anyone between her and anything but her. So she did what she had always done. She wrapped her scarf across her face, and she took a lead rope and a lantern that the wind put out in 3 steps, and she went out into it after the colt. She found him. That was the awful mercy of it. She found him, a 1/4 mile off, down in the lee of a drift where he'd blundered and gone down and couldn't rise, half buried already, his dark coat crusting white. And she got the rope on him and got him up and got him turned back toward the keep. And it was going, she thought. It was going to be all right. And then the wind swung again, and the last light went, and the world became a single white roar, with no up in it and no direction. And she understood, with the flat, cold calm that stood in her, instead of fear, that she no longer knew which way the keep was. She kept the colt moving. That was all she could do. She kept him against her body for the warmth of him, and she picked a direction, and she went, because to stop was to die, and she knew that the way you know a hard fact, without feeling it. The cold got into the mended seam of her boot, and then into her foot, and then her foot stopped being cold, which is worse. Her hands on the rope stopped being hands, the scarf froze to her face. She thought, at some point, of her mother's voice in the fog, "Hide what you are," and thought, with something like grim humor, that she had hidden it so well that she was about to die anonymous, in a drift, a 1/4 mile from a king who had spent 10 years looking for her. She thought, he'll never know, he'll find a frozen stable hand in the spring thaw, and never know it was her. And that thought, not the cold, not the fear, that one thought, was the first thing in the whole ordeal that made her want, with a sudden animal ferocity, to live. She did not know how long she walked. She was on her knees in a drift with the colt down beside her, and her own eyes closing, when the dark ahead of her tore open with light. Torches, many of them, guttering and streaming in the wind, and shapes came out of the white, and a voice she knew, a voice she would have known in any storm on any night at the end of any world, was roaring her name into the wind, not Wren, but the other one, the true one, over and over, cracked and wild and stripped of every cold thing. Neve. Neve. And then he was there, on his knees in the drift, hauling her up against him, and she felt the heat of him through all the cold, like a fire through a wall, and she tried to tell him about the colt, that the colt had to come, that she wouldn't come without the colt, and her frozen mouth wouldn't shape it, and he understood anyway. He always understood, from the outside in, and men behind him took the colt, and he took her, lifted her whole off the ground against his chest, with her frozen face in his neck, and turned and carried her back into the light, and out of the killing dark. And the last thing she knew before the warm blackness took her was his voice, low now, close against her frozen ear, gone from roaring to the other thing, the breath voice, her own voice given back to her. Easy. I have you. Easy now. She woke to warmth, and to firelight, and to the weight of many blankets, and to the sound of a man breathing not far off, and it took her a long, swimming moment to understand where she was, because she was not behind her lock. She was in a room she had never seen, larger, plainer, a soldier's room for all it was a king's, with weapons on the wall and a great fire roaring in a great hearth, and no ornament anywhere, except a single window of green glass through which the storm still howled, muffled now by stone. She was in a bed that was not hers, under blankets that were not hers, in a shift that was not hers, and her hands and her feet ached with the deep, screaming ache of frozen things coming back to life, which is the good ache, the living ache, and she was so wrapped in warmth that for a moment she could not move at all, and did not want to. He was in a chair by the fire, and he had not slept. She could see that at once. The grey of exhaustion in his hard face, the way he sat forward with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on her, the way he had clearly been sitting for hours, the way a man sits by a thing he has nearly lost. When he saw her eyes were open, he did not move, at first. He only let out a long breath, as though he had been holding it since the drift. "The colt," she said. Her voice was a ruin. "Alive," he said. "In the stable, with his mother. Warm. You didn't lose him. You nearly lost yourself for him. You reckless, impossible." He stopped. He passed a hand over his mouth. The gesture she'd seen in the stable on the first day. The gesture of a man mastering something. "You nearly died. Do you understand that? Another quarter hour, and there'd have been nothing to carry back. You went out into the worst storm in 40 years, alone, for a foal, and you didn't tell a soul, because it did not once occur to you, it still hasn't occurred to you, that there is now a single living person in this world who would rather the foal froze 1,000 times over than lose you once. There wasn't time to. There is always time to send a boy up a hill," he said, and there was an edge in it now, but she understood the edge, because she had heard the same edge in her own voice with frightened horses, the sharpness that is only fear wearing a harder coat. "You don't send the boy because you've spent 10 years being the only one who'll go into the storm. I know. It's the same reason you sleep behind a lock and mend a boot past mending and drink tea that would kill a lesser woman. You've made yourself into a person who needs no one, because needing someone got everyone you loved killed. I understand it. I have watched you do it for 3 weeks and understood every stitch of it." He looked at her, and something in his hard face came undone, and here it was, at last, the thing beneath the thing. "But I nearly buried you tonight, Neve. Twice in my life I have knelt in the snow of your ruin. The first time I was too late, and there was nothing there but a scent going to a river. Tonight I was almost too late again, and I found that I could not, that a second time would have..." He stopped. He could not finish it. And she watched the King of the North, who did not raise his voice because he had never needed to, who had held the passes for a decade with a coldness his own captains feared, sit in a chair by his own fire and fail, entirely, to finish a sentence, because the end of it was a thing too large and too broken to be said aloud, and she understood that she was watching him do the thing he had never done for anyone. She was watching him let the coat come off. She was watching him ease, and she understood that he had learned it from her, from 3 weeks of watching her fail to do it, and had chosen, tonight, with her nearly dead in his bed, to go first. So she did the only thing there was to do. She told him her truth, to meet his. She gave him the last hidden seam. "I have never once, in 10 years, let myself want anything," she said quietly, from the warm dark of the blankets. "Do you understand? Not a new boot, not enough food, not a fire, not a friend. I taught myself out of wanting, the way I taught myself the rue, every morning, a little at a time, because wanting is a door, and I could not afford a single open door. You want, you hope, you let one warm thing in, and then the world knows where to hurt you. So I rubbed it all out, every want. I got so good at it I forgot I was doing it. Hala saw it. She said I'd hidden myself from myself, and she was right, and I hated her for being right. She drew a breath, and it hurt, the good hurt of a living thing. And then you cut me a key, and you mended my boot instead of buying me one, because you understood the difference without my telling you. And you let the laugh come back and didn't make anything of it. And every night for 3 weeks, you sat in the near chair and did not once reach across the table and let me cross the distance, a hair at a time, on my own, in my own time. And somewhere in the middle of all that mending and not reaching, I started to want again, and it terrified me more than the storm did. Because the storm can only kill me. The wanting can, and now it was her turn to fail to finish, her turn to trail off into the thing too large to say, and she looked at him across the firelit room, both of them wrecked, both of them stripped, both of them for once with all the coats off at the same time. That's why I went into the storm without sending the boy, she said finally. Not because I forgot I had you, because some part of me is still trying, even now, not to. The fire cracked. The storm leaned on the green glass. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, because it had all been spoken. And then Ronan of the Iron Veil rose from his chair by the fire and crossed the room. Slowly, the way he did everything, giving her every step of the distance to stop him. The way you approach a wild thing that has come, against all its instinct, to the edge of your open hand, and he sat on the edge of the bed where she lay wrapped in the warmth of his own blankets, and he did not seize her, and he did not speak, and he lifted one hand, and, with the backs of 2 scarred fingers, so lightly it was hardly a touch at all, brushed a strand of half-frozen hair back from her cheek. She did not pull away. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. She, who had slept 10 years with one foot pointed at the door, who had rubbed the want off her skin every morning like frost off glass, who had gone into a killing storm rather than admit she had someone to lose, she did not pull away. His fingers stilled against her cheek and stayed there, warm now where she was cold, and she felt the warmth of them go into her, the way the warmth of the mug had gone into her frozen hands on the 9th evening, painful and necessary, a thawing, the deep ache of a living thing coming back. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The whole storm-shaken night narrowed down to that one point of contact, 2 fingers and a jaw, and the small warm distance between his face and hers, which was no longer the length of a table. She was the one who closed it. She wanted that noted, afterward, in the private ledger she kept of her own life, that in the end, after all the crossing he had let her do a hair at a time, it was she who closed the last of the distance. She turned her face a fraction into his hand, so that his palm came against her cheek, and she felt the split-knuckled roughness of it, the horseman's hand, the fighter's hand, and she brought her own ruined, half-frozen hand up out of the blankets and laid it over the back of his, holding it there, holding him there, and then she moved, the smallest possible amount, and he moved to meet her. And their foreheads came together first, brow to brow, breath to breath, in the firelight, and they stayed like that, not kissing, only breathing the same warm air in the cold of the ancient room, close as 2 people can be without yet being one thing, for a long moment that she would spend the rest of her life failing to describe. Then he kissed her. It was not what the tales made of a king's kiss, all appetite and conquest. It was slow, and it was careful, and it tasted of the cold and the fear and the long grief of them both, and it was warm, so warm, warmer than the fire, warmer than the blankets, and it went through her, not like a storm, but like a thaw, like the first true morning of a spring, after a winter that has lasted 10 years, when the ice lets go of the eaves all at once, and the whole frozen world begins, quietly, everywhere, to run. She felt the bond she had spent a decade drowning rise up in her at last, unmasked, unhidden, unafraid, and reach across the small, warm distance and find its other half, and settle, the way a foaling turns and settles under a patient hand, from something wrong into something right. She had thought it would feel like a rope. It did not feel like a rope. It felt like a door she had been leaning against for 10 years, with her whole weight, in the cold, finally opening, not being broken down, not being forced, only opening, from the inside, because at last, she had chosen to stop leaning and let it swing. When they parted, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed saying, and everything that did had already been said in the kiss. He drew back only far enough to look at her, and she looked at him, and outside the green glass the great storm of 40 years began, at last, to slacken and to fail, its roar thinning to a wail, and then to a whisper, and then to the vast pillowed silence of deep snow. And inside the room there was only the fire, and the warmth, and the two of them, and the bond settled between them like a thing that had come home. He did not press for more, and she did not offer it, and neither of them thought it strange. He only lay down beside her, over the blankets, still in his clothes, a careful hand's breadth of space kept out of a habit of respect that neither of them needed any more, but both of them honored, and she turned toward the warmth of him in the dark, and put her frozen feet, thawing now, aching, alive, against his shin, unforgivably, the way you do to someone you have decided to keep. And he made a low sound that was almost a laugh, and did not pull away, and she fell asleep like that, unmasked, unhidden, unlocked, in an Alpha King's bed, with her scent rising free off her own skin for all the world to find, and for the first time in 10 years, she did not dream of the fog. She woke once, near dawn, in the blue dark, to the storm gone and the fire low, and lay still a moment, taking the measure of the strangeness, the warmth at her back, the arm across her, the not being alone. And she found, checking herself the way she'd check a horse for a hidden lameness, that the old readiness was not there. The one foot pointed at the door, the ear turned always toward the loft's small stairs. The animal watchfulness she had carried so long she'd forgotten its weight. It was not gone. A thing 10 years deep does not go in a night. But it had, for the first time, set itself down. She lay in the warm dark and did not watch the door. She thought about that. She thought, I am not guarding anything. She thought, there is nothing I am holding shut. And she pulled the king's arm a fraction closer across her ribs, deliberately, the way she did everything, and let herself sleep again. And this time when she woke, it was full morning, and the light through the green glass was the same cold, clarifying silver it had been in the stable on the first day, and she lay in it and thought that the light, at least, was the same, but that she was not. The spring came late that year, as it does after a hard winter, and then all at once, as it also does, and by the time it came the thing between them had long since stopped being a question. Some part of the change had a shape the court could see, and some part did not. The part they could see, that the stable hand still went down the hill every morning in her own wool to muck the stalls and walk the yearlings, but that she came up in the evenings now to a table for two that had become, without anyone announcing it, the true center of the keep, that the king, who had been a winter of a man for a decade, had begun, imperceptibly and then unmistakably, to thaw, to speak more, to be seen once, by a scandalized page, actually laughing in the yard at something the small grey woman had said. The part they could not see was all the rest of it, the rituals, the mug, the boot, the low breath voice, the 10,000 small unspoken things that two hard people build between them when they have both, against all their training, decided to stop guarding the door. Lady Sunniva Voss made her move in the last week of winter, as Wren had known she would, and it came to nothing, as Wren had also in the end arranged. The lady had gone home from the feast and done her arithmetic, and reached by whatever channels her kind command the truth of what Wren was, a fated mate, a bond-daughter, the very thing that made a stable hand into a queen and a king's 10-year celibacy into sudden dynastic sense, and she had meant to bring it back north as a weapon, to expose it before the great houses as a scandal, a low-blooded enchantment, a servant girl who had ensorcelled a king with old bloodline magic. She had gathered the houses, she had prepared the room, and Wren, who had been given the whole winter to decide whether she could bear to be someone, walked into that room first, on her own 2 mended-booted feet, and took the weapon out of the lady's hands by the simple expedient of picking it up and setting it down on the table in front of everyone herself. "I'm told there's a rumour going about," she said, into the assembled and expectant silence of the great houses of the north, in her plain, low voice, standing in her stable wool with her chipped blue mug in her hand, because she had refused, even then, to come without it. That I'm a bond daughter of the old Coldwater line, that the king's mate walked out of his own stables after 10 years hidden, that the thing he grieved is the thing he found. I'm here to save you the trouble of whispering it. It's true, all of it. My mother was Elspeth of Coldwater, and my name is Neve, and I hid what I was for 10 years with witch's rue on my wrists, because the men who murdered my whole family came for exactly the key that some of you, I'd wager, are already calculating how to use. She let that land. She had learned, in a decade of being underestimated, exactly how to let a thing land. So here is the only announcement I intend to make about it. I am not a door for any of you to open. I spent 10 years making very sure of that, and I did not survive the making of it to become, at the end, the thing my mother died to keep me from being. I chose to stay in this keep, not the bond, me. And I will be no one's key, and no one's scandal, and no one's leverage. And the first of you who tries it will discover that the King of the North is not the most dangerous thing in this hall. She lifted the chipped mug, a small salute, to the frozen and reassessing room. That's all. Thank you for gathering. There's tea, though I warn you, it's mine, and it's bitter. And that, more than any of it, more than the storm, or the kiss, or the bond settling home, was the moment the court of Cairnhold stopped seeing the stable hand and started seeing the woman. Because a person who takes her enemy's weapon and lays it on the table herself is a person no weapon works on anymore, and Lady Sunniva Voss went home to her father's holdings and did not come north again, and the great houses, who understood power better than they understood anything, adjusted themselves accordingly. Halla, when she heard of it, was said to have laughed so hard she had to sit down on a flour sack, and to have declared to the whole kitchen that she'd known the first night, up the stair, that the small grey ghost had a spine in her like an iron bar, and that she'd only been waiting for the girl to find it herself. 4 months later, in the green heart of the summer, on an evening warm enough that the windows of the private room stood open to the smell of cut hay and the sound of the yard, Wren sat in the near chair. She noted it herself, when she did it, crossed the room out of habit toward the far chair where she had sat all winter, and then, deliberately, changed her course and pulled the near chair around instead and sat in it, close, at his end of the table, where all winter she had let him keep his careful, respectful distance. He noticed too. He noticed everything. It was the thing she had learned to love in him first and most. The way he read her from the outside in. The way nothing she did was ever lost on him. He didn't say anything about the chair. He only shifted to make room and moved the draughts board. They still played, most nights. She beat him more often now, between them, and poured hot water over the dark, bitter leaves into the chipped blue mug and set it by her elbow, and the whole small liturgy of it, the mug and the board and the near chair and the open window and the summer coming in, was so exactly the shape of a life that she stopped, with a bone token in her hand, and looked at it, and felt the size of the thing she had almost thrown into a snowbank rather than let herself have. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to not do the thing where you're kind about it and make it small, so it won't frighten me. I need you to let it be as large as it is." He set down his piece. All right. She looked at the mug. She looked at the board. She looked at the mended boot on her own foot, the ugly patient boot he had sewn on the 11th night, and that she still wore, would wear till it fell off her, because mending was not the same as giving, and this was the difference she had spent her whole life learning. She looked, last, at him. The grey at his temple, the scar on his jaw, the pale eyes gone warm as ice never goes, watching her with the whole of his attention, the way he had watched her across the straw on the first morning. "For 10 years, she said, "I was a woman a bond happened to. Something my mother sewed into me. Something the raiders came for. Something you caught on the wind and grieved. A thing that was done to me, that I spent every morning of a decade trying to undo. I never once got to be a woman who chose. There was never a single door I walked through because I wanted to. Only doors I fled through, or hid behind, or leaned against with my whole weight to keep from being opened." She drew a breath, And it did not hurt now. That was summer for you. That was healing. The good ache long gone. So I'm telling you this, so it's said plainly, and can't be mistaken for the bond, or for gratitude, or for a stable hand who got warm and comfortable, and stopped running. I didn't choose you because I was fated to. I was fated to, and I spent 10 years fleeing it, and I'd have kept fleeing it to the end of my life, if it had stayed a rope. I chose you because you cut me a key, and swore there was no copy, and there wasn't. I chose you because you mended the boot, instead of buying it. I chose you because every single night you sat in the far chair and let me be the one to cross the room. And never once, not in the storm, not in the bed, not before the whole shrieking court, did you make me a key. You are the only person in my whole life who found out what I was and did not, for one single moment, want to use it. She reached across the small distance and put her rough split-knuckled hand over his rough split-knuckled hand, the way she had in the firelit room, holding him there. I am not staying because of the bond. I am staying because I looked at every door in the world, including the open one you kept swearing you'd never lock, and this is the one I want to be behind. Me, Neve, choosing, for the first time in my life, wanting a thing out loud and reaching for it in the daylight, instead of rubbing it off my wrists at dawn. She held his eyes. This life, this keep, this mug and this board, and this ugly mended boot, and you, I choose it. That's the whole of it, and I needed you to hear me say it in my own words, on a summer evening, with nothing forcing my hand, because a thing you're fated to is a thing that happens to you, and a thing you choose is a thing you do, and I have spent 10 years being happened to, and I am done. From here I do the choosing, and I choose this. He did not for once master himself. He turned his hand over under hers so their palms met, and he held on, and whatever he might have said he did not say, because his voice would not have carried it, and she understood, because she always understood him now, from the outside in, that his failing to finish the sentence was the truest and largest answer he could have given, and she let it be as large as it was, and did not make it small. That night she stood at the open window of the private room, in the warm dark, with the summer coming up off the fields, and the sound of the horses in the yard below, and looked out over the valley where her whole small hidden life had lain buried under 10 years of snow and rue, and where now, in the green dark, the lights of the keep and the village and the far crofts came on one by one, warm and unafraid, no lantern of them hidden, no scent of anything drowned. Down the hill, in the stable, the colt she had gone into the storm for stood dozing against his mother's flank, tall now, half-grown, willful as ever, alive. In the kitchens, Halla was banking the fires and grumbling to no one. On her own foot, the mended boot sat easy, keeping the summer dust out, as it had kept the winter wet, still ugly, still hers. And on the table behind her, the chipped blue enamel mug sat empty in the moonlight, the one thing she had carried up the hill out of 10 years of having nothing, and she thought, the way she still at the high moments thought in the old pattern, one clear thing after another. She thought about the first morning, and the silver light across the straw, and the single word said into the silence. She thought about how she had knelt with her hands full of a new life, and felt her whole self rise off her skin into the cold, unmasked at last, and had believed, in that moment, that the world had ended. It had not ended. That was the thing no one had told her, in 10 years of teaching herself to expect the worst. Sometimes the irreversible thing that happens to you, the thing you cannot undo, the frost that comes to the glass overnight, sometimes it is not the ending you have braced your whole life to survive. Sometimes it is only the morning you are finally found. Outside, over the dark valley, the first of the summer's warm rain began to fall. Not snow, not this time, not the killing white that had erased the world, but rain, soft and dark and everywhere, coming down over the lit and unhidden crofts, and the sleeping horses, and the whole green valley that had, without asking her, and with her whole glad consent, become her home. And she stood in the open window and let it come, and did not this time brace against any of it, And behind her in the warm dark, a low voice she would have known at the end of any world, said the two words she had taught it, the words that had passed between them 100 times and meant, now, everything they had never needed to say aloud, easy now. And she turned from the window, and went to him, and was.